Hi, everyone. So, we're going to continue our discussion of abbreviated fiction. Last week we talked about prose poetry and it including fiction elements. The readings this week they may seem a little similar to what you read last week. But something that I mentioned in the announcement is that the authors that we're reading this week primarily identify as prose writers, meaning writing in sentences, and not poets who use verse. That's not to say there are certain poets who don't use verse, there are some. But we're going to shift and look a little bit at the term flash fiction and how that's different from prose. So, this first question, what's in a flash? And I didn't really think about where I was putting this thing, but now I'll put it there. What's in a flash? Basically, you have to have story. That's one of the biggest differences between prose poetry and flash fiction. If prose poetry relies more heavily on the poetic elements, and prose poetry was defined, Charles Baudelaire, who you read, and we read last week and we read at the beginning of the semester, pretty much coined the term prose poetry just through his own writing of prose poetry with Paris Spleen, was the name of the book. But poetry is an experience, right? And poetry is abstract and it's open to a lot of different types of interpretation, and it's not necessarily tied in to a diegetic, into diegesis, which is the story, the world of the story. I can talk. And so with flash fiction, there has to be some kind of fiction elements. Character, plot, which it's hard to have events transpiring without character, even if you're talking about the seasons changing, the natural elements become characters, but there's a concrete quality that falls into the narrative realm. And so that's where we'll see differences. Doesn't mean that what you read last week, or if you come across something that claims it's prose poetry, that it can't be called flash fiction. But flash has a couple other things that helps distinguish it from other types of short prose. If we're looking at the form and the formal elements, flash is shorter than 1,000 words. When you get below 500 and 200 and 100 and down to 50 words, you have different names like nanofiction and microfiction, drabbles too. But if we're looking at anything under 1,000 words is considered flash. 1,000 to 2,000 words is short fiction, sudden fiction, etc. But flash is kind of a generally used term for fiction that's under 1,000 words. It involves character, it has scene and plot and prose sentences. Those are the four main characteristics. So I have this book that I teach in my creative writing class, and I thought that there's some really great essays in here about flash fiction. And so I thought that I would read to you what's on the screen there, which is easier for me to read in here. Kim Chinky, right, who's the author of the flash fiction prose poetry collection Oh Baby, the forthcoming flash fiction prose poetry collection Pretty. Notice how she uses flash fiction prose poetry, so it goes back and forth. So somebody who writes in these genres, and I write prose poetry too, I have a poem coming out next month, but I would mostly consider myself a fiction writer. But her books contain a hybrid compilation of both these things. If we look at the page here, she starts with plot, the sequence or progression of events in a play, novel, film. We know that, right? We know the Freytagian structure. Why does she put that definition there? So that she can then talk about flash in relation to plot. Is it essential in flash fiction, she asks. I can only stress the importance of plot in any literary genre. Literary genre is different from form. Okay, so form would be fiction, poetry, nonfiction, etc. So the importance of plot in any literary genre. And though flash fiction is its own little devil, getting away with bending many rules, this genre is not excused from plot. In many cases, the sequence of events in a particular flash may be difficult to distinguish. Likely in flash fiction, plot is often presented in non-traditional ways, arising through other elements necessary to make a successful literary story. Character, language, point of view, setting, structure, voice. Each element can be accountable for plot. Interesting. So language can be accountable for plot as opposed to the actual element of plot, like rising action, climax, etc. For example, she says, Rhythmic language in a piece can suggest playfulness. And juxtaposed with some eccentric detail, the combination of these elements here can make a good flash fiction. Deadpan tones of horrifying accounts can justify a plot line. A third-person flash ending in first person can twist a piece and thus render it successful. Notice these are formal elements. It's not content, it's how the content is presented. So the formal elements are being used to convey the story. Providing descriptive elements and omitting the events can also work. When used effectively, omission of details can gear a plot. We know this, we read Hemingway, we talked about omission. Plot is vital in flash fiction, propelling it to its brevity. And brevity means short, right? So that is the key difference in saying this is flash fiction, this is prose poetry. I am not one to put things into boxes. I love an argument of this could be prose poetry because these events are experiential. They're more poetic than they are prose. But something to think about too when we talk about flash and what you're reading this week and in the coming weeks is what Shinki quotes here, which is Aristotle's Poetics emphasizes the importance of plot in drama, stating the plot is the essential element of a tragedy. The plot does not concern what has happened as an isolated incident. So basically, event is not the only necessity of plot. The surrounding elements procure it. That means what happens is not the only aspect of plot. And she goes to Aristotle because Aristotle is most known for his observations of form and rhetoric, right? So looking at poetics, talking about drama and the structure of story, she's making the argument here that flash fiction doesn't have to be explicit in the way it addresses story. So what does that mean? And here I'm going to move this little thing. Hopefully you guys can see this little screen that I'm moving around. It says you should be able to, but so what is flash in juxtaposition to regular storytelling? It's stripped down is what I call it. Stripped down story, but not stripped down to the bones of narrative, to the other elements of language and surprise. I'm engaged with a lot of flash writers, and I did a recent interview with a flash fiction blog interviewer that'll be coming out in a few months, and I read it, and most of the time when I read it, this idea of surprise and language comes up. So what can I say about flash? Words carry twice the weight under the duress of constraint. So you have 1,000 words. You want it to be pretty and engaging, and you want to conjure image. And image is another thing that I focus on when I'm writing flash, and that I know a lot of other flash writers do. But you still need to convey events, right? So it's weighing a word as conveying a feeling and an event at the same time. You know, a woman is not just rushing down the stairs, she's tumbling down the stairs. The word tumbling gives us a different sense of the action, right? So I say a story also loses its tails. This is something we see a lot of in film now too, where there's not a lot of preamble. You start really close to the climax and the action, and you lop off the de-escalation at the end. So there's not a lot of downtime in a flash. It's very amplified. Even if it's a quiet moment that's being amplified, there's not a lot of exposition and preamble, and there's not a lot of, you know, after the fact, this is what happened. So sometimes it lops off the denouement. And the level of language is surprising, usually. And that's where the poetic elements come into flash fiction, and that's where people blur the lines between the two, is the language that's being used can have a really poetic sentiment to it. I have down here, and I've been talking about this in my creative writing class where they were writing flash, and we did an exercise on escalating the beauty of something, but flash escalates. It doesn't come to its high point and then use the last 150 words to, you know, pontificate about something. And this is when I'm obviously talking about good flash. There's really bad flash out there. There's bad everything out there, bad music, bad movies, but a good flash that's using its form really well is going to escalate throughout, and it's going to end at a point of surprise, at a turn, just like Chinky was saying, if it changes point of view, although I have my own views on point of view and shifting. You really have to earn it with the reader. But something for you to think about is, as you're reading, is the writer has a frame about this big, the 1,000 words, and here's the story. They have to isolate what they want the reader to see in that frame. And it's going to leave out this, it's going to leave out this. And I think there's a beauty to that. This form is really popular. One of the things that you guys, and I don't have it with me here, one of the things that I assigned you guys to read for this week is there are 3 fairy tale review Twitter stories. Now Twitter's, 140 characters. That's not a lot of characters, right? How can you tell a story? Now you'll look at those and say maybe there's not a lot of story, maybe it's just a moment. But people convey stories through Twitter all the time. And living in social media has resulted in a desire for compression, for brief immersion. And so that's really opened up the door to flash fiction and short fiction, which is why we see it, being published all over the place. We're going to be looking at some literary magazines in the coming weeks, and while not all of them are flash fiction related, the reason why I want you to look at them is because we often study canonical texts, right? Stuff that's been around forever, that everybody studied. Yes, that's important. But it's also important to see who's publishing now. What is being published now? Because this is the current literary movement. And I will tell you, there is a huge faction of writers engaging in flash fiction and prose poetry. So as we move forward, we will be looking at those writers. I will say I did assign a video this week. The other video is me reading a piece of flash and talking about constructing it within the constraint. So, I generally don't teach my own work. I tried to pick like the most PC piece that wasn't going to freak anybody out. So, but anyway, I talk about how that piece connects to fairy tale. And I really think that we're going back to this creation of mythology a bit with flash fiction. That, it's something that's short enough to be remembered and to be passed on, much like a fairy tale does, but it plays with, inflating or making more robust, I think is the word that I end up using, certain parts that are not present in fairy tales, like character, for instance, or setting or logic. So those are some things to think about as we move forward. If there's anything you can get out of today, not anything, but the most important thing to get out of today in contrast to last week is that the formal elements of flash fiction are really what set it apart, that it involves plot most of the time, and that plot is not necessarily represented as action, it's represented through language and surprise.